so much for joining us. I thought that maybe the place to start would be just to talk a little bit about what you've been up to recently, and that might lead us into discussion of the various elements of how we connect.
Yeah. Well, you started out by saying this is a lecture on reminding us what really rules. Is it technology or is it the human? So maybe I should tell you a quick story about that, because I really never expected to be an artist as a teenager. I was 19, and on October 21st at 4 p.m., my life kind of changed. And I was working in South Philadelphia at a furniture restoration place. I started on Monday, and I was making $2.25 an hour. So by Thursday afternoon at 4, I was like, this is just not working. And it was a moment that brought me to this place right now. And what happened was I walked over to my boss and I said, look, it's not working, I'm going to quit. And he said, you can't quit, I just hired you on Monday. I'm going to teach you how to make cabinets. And I said, look, it's not working out. And he said, look, you've got to stay here, and I'm going to teach you how to do this. Well, I said no, and I walked out. And I walked to the payphone, and I made a phone call. I called my dad, and I said, hey, Dad, I'm going to go to art school. And my dad goes, how long is this going to last? So then, my next phone call is to the Philadelphia College of Art, and I asked for admissions. And I get on the phone with this lady, and I said to her, rather naively, I want to go to art school, how do I do this? And she says, well, do you have a portfolio? And I said, what is a portfolio? So this is my way of telling you that I started from zero. And the thing that I can bring to you today is what is really important is the vision. The vision is what drives everything. And if you can have a clear vision in where you're going, it really gives you benefit on those days where you hit the speed bumps, where the shit hits the fan. And that vision is critical in getting the really big jobs done. That vision is critical in proceeding in moments that are very sticky. And so I'm telling you this because I really want to make certain that we're clear on one thing. I believe that technology is critical in this day and age in creation, especially of really big pieces, and pieces that go beyond just one person. You have a whole factory of people working on something. So it's imperative. I'd like to just run through in a couple minutes and show you where I came from, and then that brings more clarity to this moment, which is the project that I'm on. So here's my studio in the South Bronx. This is what I used to do, and it's kind of almost like a learning phase in my life where I started making art in school. It was '86, and then I went to Philadelphia College of Art, and I lucked out. I don't know if I lucked out, but I had a great education where I was handed a tradition of how to make the figure, and it wasn't how to render the figure, it was how to translate nature or reality into artistic terms. We dwelled into structural aspects of taking an armature, and that armature is proportioned to the human body and articulated like a human body. And I think that's critical in explaining that to you because there's a relationship between sculpture making and architecture. They're both all about how solids come together, and they're very similar. In fact, I see myself as an architect working with organic forms. So these are the drawings, and this might give you more insight into that. Do you see how the muscles spin? The muscles are energetic movements over architectonic forms. You see around the kneecap how things are moving. So nothing is on one plane. Everything is moving towards you or away from you. So it's really a design system. The body becomes an allegory or an analogy of how the universe is assembled. And I think that, for me, is a big motivator because because then I don't feel like I'm inventing the wheel. I belong to something that's larger than myself, and it gives me a sense of empowerment. These are some of the drawings that I did prior to the project that I'm currently involved in. That takes us to where I'm at right now. So, I was handed this project because I entered a public competition for a national memorial in Washington. And it's a blessing and it's a curse. Mostly, it goes back and forth between the two. It was a competition with 350 global teams, and I don't know how the hell I won this thing, but I have a couple ideas, and it's interesting to note that of the 350 global teams, there were only 10 teams that were analog, and I was the only team that actually did drawings that were completely by hand. I did use digital renderings to get the project done, but what really won me the competition was that I came in from a very traditional background. Since that moment, which was 2016 when I won it, I have had to take a very different approach and road, which is an embracing of technology. And I think that has a lot to do with why I'm here today.
It does.
So I'm going to go very quickly through this now, and I'm looking at the timer.
You can ignore the timer. I think that if we run over, they will be able to kick us off.
Okay. I'll listen to you on that. So the task was, give us a story that explains World War I, that's visceral and doesn't have a didactic feel to it, but has a really dramatic impact when the visitor comes to this site. So everybody's coming at me and telling me, oh, this is what you should do, and this is how you need to do the buttons, and this is how you need to do the shoelaces, and these are the type of guns that they use. And I'm like, what the fuck? And it's at that moment that I'm in the bathroom at my studio, and I have up on the wall this Michelangelo poster, which is Last Judgment. And the Last Judgment to me sent me a message that day, and it was like, do what you want to do. And I looked at that poster, and it's the intertwining and pretzeling of humanity. So it wasn't figures all by themselves, it was all figures unified. They're all wrapped together as one unit. I went back to Google, and I looked at these pictures of these soldiers, and I started to take pictures of kids that are in their 20s that came out of Brooklyn and Bronx. They're actors, and I got real uniforms that had seen combat. I bought them. They're really rather cheap, $200 each. And I dressed them up, and I got them dressed up on the stage, and I lit them, and I started taking shots with my cell phone. And from there, these are some of the images. I'll just take a few to show you. I took 12,000 shots over 9 months, and I made 9 iterations of this wall because I had to keep going back to my client to deal with back and forth of like, this is what we want. And then I would say, well, what do you want? And he would say, I'll know when I see it.
No one here has ever experienced that,
So
right?
I know there's a lot of commonality here because this is what you have to do. You have to educate your client. So it was a hell of an educated experience for him and myself in the process. Whew. This is James. James was one of the models that I used. And James is a contractor in New York City who has a really strong business, over 40 employees, really high cash flow, does quite well. And he wanted to work for me, and I was like, well, why, James, do you want to work for me? You have a life? And he was like, please. So he starts posing for me, and then one day after one of these sessions, he came over to me and said, all right, I need to tell you something. This is why I'm interested in World War I. My great-great-grandfather was killed in World War I. I was like, wow, James, that's horrible. And then he goes, but that's not really why I want to do this. Then my great-great-uncle was in World War I as well, and he came home and with his service revolver, he shot his wife, and then he shot his daughter, and then he shot himself. Sorry. This is why I'm doing the project, because it's about us and who we are, and that happened 100 years ago. And if you look at that as something that's in a history book, and it was done 100 years ago, and that's all it's about, then you're missing the point. So the point being is, this project is about us as humans, and the way that I put it together had a lot to do with what you guys do, using technology to be creative. And so I went through this process then of doing these drawings, and I came to, I'm going to jump ahead now. These are just other images. This is an iteration. I would assemble them. So I did 9 of these. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And these are some of the iterations in my studio. So from here, I finally got through after a while. This is the structure behind. Catching up. So from these images, the photographic images, I had to translate them into art terms. I went back then and did drawings. So I'm waiting for the drawing to pop up.
So am I.
I get good problems.
At least.
All right, so
The transcendence of the human experience over technology.
So I did a drawing that was the template. The drawing became the blueprint then for the next step was how do you translate it into a sculpture? This is where it gets tricky because sculpture takes a long time and you can't really do this in a long time type framework when you're working for the US government, especially since they're really art connoisseurs. And they know everything about art. That was my experience from our meetings. So these are just the structural drawings. I want to just get to the drawings if you can. And if not, then I'll just keep chatting away. So I took this project then to a place in New Zealand, which was what a workshop to build the sculpture in 7 months. It's unheard of. 38-figure composition with a span of 10 feet. And
I can see it, and it's really lovely. It tells me it's connected. Can we have that technician please come up? Okay, let's see here. Good.
okay, so we just pop forward. Thanks. Thank you for your patience. Okay, these are the drawings. This was another attempt. I'm just going to run through these. These were just translations. All right, so this was iteration, and there's this underlying structure. There's a big X that runs through it. Sorry, the X is about transformation. Transformation is what World War I did to the world. It changed us from a modern society to what we have today, and we're coming out of that right now, Justin. So I'm just going to run through these quickly. Here's the drawing. This was a 700-hour drawing done in 10 weeks. Again, pedal to the metal because I'm dealing with a client who says, oh, just go do the drawing. It'll take you a couple hours.
Oh, just press that button and the work's done, right?
Yeah. So there's a lot of that. All right, so these were new pictures. That's my daughter. And then here we are. We're moving over to the sculpture production. And this is where the technology really comes in hard. And I don't know, you all know ZBrush? That's what we're working with. The ZBrush was a way to assemble the figures. The figures were constructed off photographs so we shot each of those figures in New Zealand and around. And then the sculpture technicians took them, assembled them, but then this is where it gets sticky. The technicians were really good at the technical aspect, but not the creative, artistic aspect. and their vision is separate. Each part is a separate component, it's not cohesive. So that's where I came in, and I was like, no, you have to do it this way. You need to think in how each figure touches the next figure, and then how that interrelates to the next grouping. So this is about unity and hierarchy of parts of the whole. So you have one unit, and then you have 3 units within that, and then each of those beginning, middle, and end have a story within that. This was a styrofoam test. We did 5 of those in a month on a CNC machine, and the CNC machine was a way to establish the depth and the cohesion of all the parts very quickly and rapidly, so that I could approve it so we could move on to the next stage. This is the drawing that explains the story, and I'm telling you that this is very human because story is human, and I'm told that every day by my wife, Tracy Slatt, who's a novelist, who's kind of educated me in that process as well. So she told me, you did the hero's journey. I didn't know I was doing the hero's journey. I was just doing a story, and I learned that that is the story that is all over in every culture, in every society, in every moment of time, globally. And it's a story about a man here. It's called A Hero's Journey. It's called A Soldier's Journey. That's what the project was named. Who leaves home. That's the beginning. He joins his band of brothers. He crosses the threshold, which is the Atlantic, and from there enters into the fray of battle, which is the initiation. The initiation is the challenge. It's the crisis, it's the test. And from this battle scene, you see how it drives down into the ground, and then from there you rise up. And from this death of the battle scene right in the middle, you can see you have a rebirth, and that's the father figure coming out directly at you. That's the transformation. And then you have the end, which is the return home, and the father appears within this sculpture 6 times. In the last scene, he hands his daughter the helmet. She represents the next generation, and the helmet obviously is World War I. She looks into World War I and divines the future, which is World War II. So this was my way of doing a war memorial. It's about war, but it's also about life. It's about healing, and it's about what each and every one of us go through in our own life. Going back to the process, once we moved off the styrofoam, these are the plastic pieces. There were 128 of them. They were printed in China in 6 days, shipped back and forth from New Zealand to China, and then those were molded in box molds, and we're translating this now into clay. Hot clay is poured into the molds, and here are all the parts, each of them numbered, and then those are taken and reassembled. It gives you an idea of the scale. From there, again, I was told, okay, we want this now. And I'm like, I need a little bit more time. And no, we want it now. And so I ended up working 61 days for 12 hours a day for 61 days, and it makes me nauseous thinking about it. I'm laughing, it's a tragic thing. So, I'm going to hand this back to you soon. Here's the clay. And while I was at the shop, they all looked at me like, why are you fucking up the piece? And I'm like, just watch. And as I continued to sculpt, I made it more cohesive. So all these parts flow together. And I made adjustments, and I did something that they thought was radical. I placed a human fingerprint on the work. I took away the mechanical fingerprint, and I put the human fingerprint on the work. And I think that's critical. Here's disassembly, which leads to molding. Box molds again, and reassembly. Oh, sorry, it's going backwards. And then printing, pouring in the box molds. We're going to the next step, which is resin pour, reassembly, and shipping. Now we're shipping the molds, or the pieces, back to the US. Here's the piece in resin. Here it is in resin. And February 18th was the meeting with the Commission of Fine Arts. And I was like, oh, this is going to be great. They're going to go, oh yeah, this is awesome.
I thought you'd learned that.
I'm so naive. I'm sorry. I learned my lesson. It was like the worst day of my life. I felt like I was going to puke. And they were like, oh, they wouldn't even get up out of their chairs to go up and look at it. Because they wanted it to be a park that was a landscape park, about trees and benches and water. And they didn't want anything at all to do with a representation of us. And that's what this is. It's a representation of us because that's what we look like. It's an image of human beings. And anyway, long story short, we just passed last month because of some leverage applied in the government. And it shows how things really work in Washington. I'm not going to say anything, but you can read between the lines. This is more or less what we talked about before. So I'm all yours if you want to interrogate me.
Indeed. Well, perhaps we might start with a couple of... If it's interesting, then it's not too long.
All right.
Perhaps we might start with a couple of quick questions related to that. What you're showing here, you say, is part of the approval process, obviously not the final piece. We're looking at a maquette.
Yeah.
What scale is this maquette?
The maquette is 10 feet long. The figures are 30 centimeters high, about 12, 14 inches. And it's a maquette that is 1/6 scale. So we're looking at a final product of 56 to 60 feet in length, and the figures would be 6'6".
Okay. So how do you deal with that in the workshop we saw?
Yeah, well, here's the thing. That's why I showed you those images in the South Bronx. Because it's like, there's no way in heck that I could do this project in that room. The ceiling height is too low. And not to mention that it's, how does one man do a project of such enormity and epic scale without a little bit of help from his friends? Technology. I'm the last person on the planet that would use technology. And here I am, really looking at it. I did a little research for the last 4 months around technology and how this could help me, and I found a foundry in Europe that uses a lot of it as Pangolin editions, and they make good use of enlarging machines. And so I'd have a crew there. I'd take that piece and scan it and blow it up with the foam so that I'm already starting at full scale, but I'd come down ½ an inch from the surface, and then we go to town using hands and 4 or 5 sculptors. And there's a timeline on this where I would have to pop this out in 4.5 years, and they're squeezing me now. They're saying, well, we want it in 3 years, and we want it at half the price. And I'm saying,
And twice.
hello, this is my friend Tobias, and he'll talk to you. And Tobias is a lawyer. And I know, but it's like a nervous laugh, guys, right? This is what we all have to deal with. It's like, as an artist, you're always undervalued. And I think what, for myself, it really has happened. It's like, you gotta leverage your power against the client, and he needs to respect you for what you're worth. And I think what's happened for myself in the project and all the things I've gone through lately is I've really had to realize what my self-worth is, what my earning power is, and then I can come back and say, okay, you don't like my numbers, then You do it, I'll send you a couple webinars. And that's really the story.
Okay, all right. Well, we've run extremely long, so we're only going to run through a few questions, but nevertheless, I think it's important for this audience to recognize some of the base ideas that connect where and who you are and where we are, how we do what we do, and why. So a first question in those terms might be that you're here in front of a community of built environment technologists, and that seems very different to what would be your usual audience. And why are you here? What attracted you to the idea of speaking to a group like this today?
There are a couple answers to that. I share a great commonality with all of you. We're all creatives. And I think that we're in a position where we need to really figure out individually how we are going to proceed in our life and not give up our dreams. And it's a difficult thing because it's like I see a lot of it with the foundry workers and the technicians that I work with, that they have sold their souls for security in the short run, but in the long run, it's like it's a hell because that paycheck then locks them down. So it's, I guess maybe my message, I'm one to really, I live in chaos sometimes in terms of like, how am I going to pull this one off? And that's why I said in the very initial stage, I hold on to the vision. The vision is to play forward what I'm really tied to. So I think finding out what your vision is critical in how you proceed and gives you the courage to proceed on those days.
Talking in technology in a conversation recently, you said technology is a mechanical way of viewing the universe. What did you mean by that? You know, in contrast, what does it mean to have a humanistic view of the universe?
Yeah, well, this is really critical. Because you are a human being, you perceive because you are a human being, you perceive reality through your senses that are human. When you use a computer, for example, to build a figure, and I can only speak for what I do, so I don't want to tread in your territory, but if a machine translates the figure into the sculpture versus a human being translating the figure into a sculpture, or per se, if the human being can control the machine to do what he needs, meaning he drives his vision through the machine and it pops out the other side as the sculpture that he wishes, he's in control because his perceptions of the way figures are assembled is clear to his experience, and my experience was 50,000 hours of looking at life models over 25 years. And so I got a keen sense of how things are proportioned, how they're assembled, how you break them down into parts, and you still hold on to that single figure so it doesn't look wonky, you know? And I'm saying this as an allegorical statement. That's what you're doing when you're building something. There is a correctness to things, and that correctness is driven by your perception of how you see things if you've had a lot of experience doing that. And that correctness is the way the universe is assembled mathematically, with its rhythms, how things respond to each other through curves, how things are proportioned mathematically. And so there's a correctness. There's a correctness also to interiors, to the spaces that you live in. And when you enter into a space that is correctly designed, or you look at a sculpture that is correctly designed, it has a way of elevating you individually to a higher level of, I'm going to say, feel good, feel better in the space. So this might be a little revolutionary because I don't think that everybody's opinion is valid. And I think that some people know better than other people. And so that is critical also, that there's not democracy in art. There's a sense that there are people that are hierarchically more gifted, that know how things are assembled better. And so then you get into the issue of like, well, who is correct, who is not correct? And we're living in a time that this is very politically incorrect, what I'm saying to you. But I think it's imperative that you take home from this that education drives the correctness. And it's not just like all levels of design are equal. Some levels of design are far superior than others. And why is that? And I think it has to do with the reliance on the human experience and the truthfulness of going back to that as the litmus test. Because you as a human being, if you've had a lot of experience in looking at things, you really begin to see how things are assembled proportionally, mathematically, rhythmically. And these are all elements of what architects, designers, sculptors, painters, craftsmen, musicians, dancers do. So, sorry, a bit rambling, but...
No, it's always fascinating to hear that perspective, because you talked several times about vision, but it's also the passion, it's also the drive to fulfill the things that you're trying to achieve. You told the story in relation to your portfolio, but not the follow-on step to that story, which was going away and creating a portfolio and coming back to that person emissions.
Yeah, I did after I came, I left the art school and I went to the bookstore, Joseph Fox bookstore, and I bought Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain. And I'm starting at scratch, and I drew every night from 5 till 8 or 9, and after 3 months I had 90 drawings, so I went back to the admissions lady with the 90 drawings. So it's I think that a lot of it is practice. And I mean, it's like a persistence that is critical. I could never work for somebody. I have trouble with a collaborative system.
That resonated.
I don't want to say anymore.
All right, well, you also during your training traveled to Italy, and Sabin's father is Italian. I'm sorry, your mother is Italian, and he would spend summers back in Italy, but you did an apprenticeship in Italy, and you know that clearly had a significant impact. So the question would be, how do people follow the path that you have trod? Is the form of education that you have experienced, how do people experience that themselves?
I had 2 apprenticeships, one in Philly with a sculptor that had been doing liturgical art when I was very young, at 26. And then I went back to Italy and had another apprenticeship for 2 years with somebody who did portraits. And it was imperative in my creative process of learning. And I'm still learning. Every day I'm learning. So it taught me not only about making art, but it also taught me how to integrate my art into society, because it became a business too. And the actual aspect of, you don't just go to the studio and make your art. You have to make art, and then it has to serve a larger group of people. It's not just your thing that you do in the shop. And that taught me early on that it was a way to integrate into society, because it's then a financial transaction. You make the art, you're worth something. And it's not a gallery system, it's a professional system. And I think that's what you're all dealing with here. And so I think that there's a problem though in art schools, because they don't integrate you into what's the next step? You come out of art school and there you are in debt, and then it's like, how are you going to run your business? You got to pay back your debt. How do you proceed? So you end up then getting slotted into a job that gives you a paycheck so you can pay back your schooling, and then you're not practicing your art, you're not practicing your vision, you're not practicing elevation of yourself so that you can be worth more. And so I think we have a little bit of a failure right now in the creative system. And you and I had a conversation. I think the guild system is an amazing way to deal with this because it incorporates the actual aspect of money making, marketizing your skills.
Okay. All right. We are running well over, so we're going to have to wrap this up shortly. Not quite yet. I have 2 more things I want to speak about with you. But I'm more just trying to reassure Bob at this point that he's going to be able to get on stage eventually. But you said something in that conversation that I thought is an important message to this audience, and the follow-on to that, which was that technology needs to mesh with the human mind to create something that still has human fingerprints.
Yes.
You talked a little bit about the change in the piece here, from the technological fingerprint to the human fingerprint.
Yeah.
And that led, in our discussion before, to the issue of commoditization of us. That we are starting to approach our businesses, our clients, on the basis of our value through the technology we use, not through the intellectual approach, the creative skills that we apply that our technology simply supports. So perhaps you can talk about that just for a moment.
Well, I think if you hold on to a vision and you're driving the technology, it changes the whole ballgame. And if I give an example of my process with the sculpture, if I listen to the technicians about how to make the piece and done piece section, it would have failed because then the technology would have usurped the artistic vision. So I thought of it more as a unifying factor. How do you deal with this construction as a unifying factor, all these parts fitting together to build the whole? And I think that maybe this is one of the things that you're talking about. Oftentimes we're living in a system where technology takes over and human story or narrative disappears. And human narrative or the story is what makes it human and what empowers you as an artist in all aspects. You know, everything tells a story. But if that is not there, then everything crumbles. And you're seeing a lot of stuff that is, well, let's give it an obvious thing. Movies today, where's the story? It's all about the special effects. It's a little worrisome to me. Does that answer you?
Yeah, I believe it does. And I must apologize. I think this is the sort of conversation where we could have taken 2 or 3 hours to sit here and go through. There's so many things that I've been very fortunate to be able to sit with you and touch on that I would love to pass on to this audience. You know, perhaps we need to get you to join us next year in Dallas, and you can talk about these various bits and pieces. Yeah, maybe Phil have you. I mean, hopefully that would be something that would be interesting to you.
Yes. Yeah.
So I'd like to finish up with one final question then, and that is simply that, you know, your last words of advice. Well, there's lots of whispering right now.
You said something, but
I said something?
yeah.
Does that mean you were wrong about your guesses?
Maybe.
Or did I throw out something there that was misdirection?
Could have been misdirection.
So, with your last, you know, what would your last words of advice be to help this audience as they leave from the event with to embrace their personal creative vision?
I think art and life are of the same nature. Wherever you are in your life, it exemplifies itself in your design, as a designer, as an architect, as a sculptor. So if you don't take care of the actual aspect of where you're headed, where you are in the rest of the other segments of your life, it starts to manifest itself in your art. And your art is your craft. And so for success, for true success of not being under somebody else's thumb, of having your creative personal vision, because each one of your personal creative visions is unique to your experience as a human being. And I think oftentimes in the daily grind of life, it's taken away, especially when you start working for other people. I really experienced this in my foray in Washington. And I took away from that, and maybe I can pass it along to you. It's like, I'm just beginning to realize now that what my value is as a creative. And it's not an easy thing to stand up to somebody and say, hey, I'm not going to do that, and you're afraid you're going to lose the contract, or you're afraid that's it. And then where's your paycheck, and how are you going to pay for your kids and your family for that month? That's the problem. So working on yourself in a way that you become stronger mentally, and you start to write down what your vision is, not for the next 2-3 years, but really, what's your ballgame? How long are you looking forward? Where do you want to end up on your obituary? What do you want people to think of you? But more importantly, what do you think of yourself, and what do you want to do with the life-given energy force that you've been given over the long haul? And so I think the thing I'm telling you is the long haul, the long road is far more important than what happens in the next 3 months. Those next 3 months might be very uncomfortable, but there's something to be said when you actually are on the path that you really wish to be on in